who I would say he basically supports the Israel answer, but he says these are very disturbing images we see from Gaza. So if I understand you correctly, what is Israel doing right now is not actually destroying Hamas, but it is even making this monster bigger, and it if puts another, other people will support Hamas because they see what Israel is doing. Is Israel at the moment acting against its own interest with this kind of warfare?
I think so, and I think there are many Israelis who understand this, but they have no voice in the government. And I doubt seriously that their views are being heard by anyone in power. You're listening to the Netanyahu wing of Israeli politics that is out for blood and feels strongly that it has to administer this object lesson or Israel won't survive, as opposed to what I am suggesting, which is if you administer the object lesson, Israel will not survive. Mm-hmm. That's my argument. And so I've said to people that would listen here in Washington, every president at some point has intervened in these conflicts involving Israel. He's operated usually as a check on Israeli power. In other words, the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal. We said no. After the counterattacks to break through the Egyptian lines, we said, no, we don't want that. Pull back to the other side of the Suez. And then we got a ceasefire. And as a result, we got an agreement, which was a very good agreement in the long run between Egypt and Israel. Right now, there is no check on Israeli power. There is no check on power from the United States being employed on Israel's behalf. I think a president today is really obligated to save Israel from itself if Israel is to survive. My great fear is that that won't happen. The entire region will line up against it, and nothing we do is going to save Israel at that point.
You mentioned before the First World War. This is highly interesting, the long road to the First World War. But I would say there was an interesting nuance or a difference that if you look at the politics in the beginning of the 20th century, my impression from what I've read, many of the superpowers of the day thought that they will actually prevail in this war and they can get something out of it. Everybody had some kind of interest in going into war and completely misjudging the situation. They thought at the end of it, we will win, surely. The Germans thought they will win. The British thought they will win. The French thought together with the Russians they will win. And isn't it so today that nobody wants a global war? Nobody wants to risk a global war, be it Russia, be it China, be it the United States, even though they seem to have a severe leadership problem in Washington at the moment. So isn't this common interest of the superpowers of today an argument which says we shouldn't panic at the moment? The scenario of a World War III in the Middle East, starting there, is not so big. What do you say? Or are you concerned that a third world war could emerge from this situation?
Well, I haven't used a World War III as a term. I just haven't, because I think that if we're exposed to even a fraction of what you're describing, people will be shocked and will reel back in fear of it. Now, the good news is that at least in Moscow, with President Putin and certainly with President Xi in China, you're talking about two men who have been in political power for at least 20 years. That's a very important point. They're experienced. They also represent countries with long memories and long histories of conflict. That makes a difference. It's helpful, because I can tell you that if anything, everything that both of those men have done since this tragedy in Ukraine began has been to deliberately limit the fight. We have provoked the Russians repeatedly, and the Russians have steadily refused to take the bait. I'll be frank with you. I'm not worried about Moscow and Beijing. I'm worried about Washington, and here's why. We suffer from a terminal case of overweening arrogance. I think people used to talk about the Deutsche Überheblichkeit. This is before World War I as a complaint. Well, that was modest compared with what goes on in Washington. And you hear these people talk about the United States today as though it were 1991. And it isn't. We're not the same country. Our economy is fragile. Our financial system is, in my judgment, in ruins, poised for all sorts of crises. Then the population itself, we're dealing with the influx of millions of people that are not us. You have that in Europe. We have it here. We're trying to sort through this. So we're not a cohesive society or nation as we once were. And in the midst of all of this, everyone seems to think that we are so powerful and so dominant that no one would dare contradict us, and that anything we want to undertake will work, that our weapons, our capabilities are superior. You don't have any reasonable debate in public about the dangers involved. We have completely forgotten war. The last time we had a war that affected Americans was World War II. And remember, the last time we had a really major war that killed 1 million of us was the Civil War. So you have a different mentality here. It's a combination of arrogance and, I would also say, ignorance. There's no understanding of the Middle East, just as there's no understanding of Eastern Europe. I've said several times, what are we doing in Ukraine? We don't know anything about Ukraine. We don't know anything about Russia. Now, certainly some of us do, but the broader population doesn't. And again, they look at what's happening in Israel and say, well, it's these Arabs again. We just have to help them defeat these people. But it's not that simple. It's a much larger problem. And by the way, there's this perception that everyone there, including Iran and Turkey, are backward. There's no appreciation for the professional competence of the Turkish armed forces, or for that matter, in the Iranian armed forces. These people are, in fact, sophisticated. They have advanced air and space capabilities, advanced missile technology, and particularly the soldiers that serve in the Turkish army, they're ferocious fighters. They're very good soldiers. There's no sense of that. So I think that's the problem: arrogance and ignorance in Washington, and then the feeling that this is Israel's moment to deal decisively with its opponents, to administer this important object lesson. Remember that throughout its history, the Israelis have always felt that if a single Jew in Israel is harmed, you must immediately strike back and crush the source, or Jews will never be safe. Well, here we sit, and we've done that. It hasn't worked very well. And now they think this is the time to strike the final blow. I would rather not see this progress to the point where everyone thinks it's the final blow. I'm sure you understand.
That's extremely interesting what you're saying. I mean, this reminds me in a horrifying way about Serbia, where the Austrians thought, now we have to solve the Serbian problem and the Germans have to help us. And they thought they would solve a local problem. And by solving this problem, which they didn't, they created a huge mess, a First World War. Is something like that probable to happen now in the Middle East, that the unhinged Israelis walk into Gaza thinking together with the Americans, with the West, we are so strong, we can fight this down to the end, we can solve this problem for good, and at the end they reap a much stronger storm from other countries. And even the Russians and the Chinese could say, now is the time to teach the West a lesson. This arrogance have to stop. As they did with the Germans, they want to collectively punish the Americans and the arrogant Westerners, epitomized by the Israeli, and we end up in a Third World War. How probable is a scenario like this?
Well, it's not impossible. It's more probable than I would like to admit. And that's exactly what I'm worried about. And of course, we're not prepared for that. By the way, in 1914, only 40% of the Imperial German army had field gray uniforms. So the Germans were not prepared for a major war either. And of course, everybody thought the same thing. You'll all be home by the time the leaves fall. That was, of course, the Kaiser's announcement. The sad truth is man forgets. we forget repeatedly. And what I'm trying to point out is that the American memory is different from the European memory, because our recollections of the past are shaped by fantasy in many cases. We think that we were better than we were, that we think we are greater than we are. And we refuse to accept the possibility that we're simply a great power. We may be the strongest in many respects of the great powers, but we're just a great power. There are other great powers. That's a problem. And no politician wants to stand up and tell Americans the truth. They all want to stand up there and say, we're the greatest people in the world. There's nothing. Listen to Biden. He's talking as though it's 1941.
Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. People are out of touch with reality. And all this World War style rhetoric is I would say, is falling on a lot of deaf ears. It's back to what I said at the beginning. Most Americans aren't really engaged anyway.
Mm-hmm. This conversation is taking a turn, which is probably too depressing for me to bear. So therefore, I have to desperately find a beam of hope at this point of our discussion. Now, I will offer a beam of hope to you, Colonel Macgregor. I've just read in the summer vacation, I've read late enough, I read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And Leo Tolstoy offers a very interesting theory. He says, the politicians, the Napoleons of this world, they are highly overestimated. What really matters is the collective will of the people. And you said something very interesting just before. I mean, you say a lot of interesting things, but something particularly interesting was when you said countries like Russia and China, they have a collective memory. And their memory tells them, we went through hell. We went through humiliation. The Chinese were humiliated by the West. The Russians went through the hell of communism. These people, they have had enough. The Germans have had enough of war. Nobody wants this. Only the Americans, as you say, they're probably a bit too self-confident. But couldn't we argue that the collective will of the people, of the individuals, which has to be taken into account by the politicians, goes against the war? And with Tolstoy, we would say that as long as the people do not want war, there won't be a war. So the will of the people is more important than the madness of the politicians. What do you make of that?
I think you're half right. The part that's wrong is the assumption that the leadership in Washington feels compelled to take into account the will of the people. They don't. That's the point. They've been allowed for decades to conduct foreign and defense policy in isolation from much public censure. In other words, no one has stood up and say, wait a minute, look, we were in Vietnam for 10 years until finally people said, that's enough. You had riots in the streets, the draft fell apart. That was 10 years. We're only at the beginning of many of these things. And again, it's back to how many Americans do you need to kill in one day to wake people up? I hear that question all the time. The politicians love air and naval power because it's sort of sex without responsibility. Once you put ground forces down, you're committed, you're accountable. But we can go back to the history of NATO and Helmut Schmidt, who made himself very unpopular at the time, at the end of his tenure. But he said, if the Americans are not on the ground here in Germany with their forces and their missiles, they will not be taken seriously, and neither will we. Well, he was right. We're trying to do everything from a distance. If that distance shrinks and we begin to do things on the ground and Americans are killed, people will start to wake up and say, what are we doing? But thus far, that hasn't happened. And of course, the press is very helpful because it doesn't report the truth. It doesn't tell the truth about the American losses that do occur. It's a huge problem. We've seldom had this in our history, but it's a new dimension of an old problem, which is most people, most of the time, don't pay attention to what happens overseas. They're much more worried about what's going on in St. Louis, Seattle, and other places, and their income and inflation and accessibility to transportation, cars, gasoline. These things are important. What happens overseas? Well, that's overseas. And I don't care much about that as long as I'm fine.
And this cognitive dissonance is very dangerous at the moment, because the Americans, who are a crucial power, of course, in this whole situation, the Americans don't feel the conflict as they did during the Vietnam War, where they had these demonstrations. So do I understand you correctly? Should we actually advocate for a new peace movement in the West? Should the people go on the streets and say to the leaders, to the collective West, or however you want to call it, stop this stupid policy of overbearing arrogance? Should the people make themselves heard in these isolated, how do you call that, echelons of power?
Well, you could try, but the problem is in the United States right now, most of that would be regarded, as it was certainly for the first 5 years or so in Vietnam, as evidence for treason, of being unpatriotic and quote unquote unsupportive of the troops. In my own family, when I was growing up in the 60s and I was a teenager, my maternal grandfather had been in World War I and World War II. In World War I, he was in the Army, and he was a ferocious opponent of Franklin Roosevelt. He hated Woodrow Wilson. And whenever the topic of war would come up, he would, say, these people were catastrophes. We shouldn't have been in any of these wars. My mother would argue with him. She lived through the Second War, and she said, well, we have to be supportive of the troops. And he would say, if you support the troops, bring them home. Well, of course, he was right. He'd been there in 1918. He thought the whole thing was a travesty, should never have happened. He was correct. But, that's a long time ago. And there aren't many of us around right now. I remember as a child, he was explaining to me his great uncle's experience on the battlefield at Gettysburg, where his great uncle lost the lower left portion of his leg below the knee, lying on the battlefield to be picked up by Confederate medics, who then turned him over to Union medics, and he survived. Not many families are like that. And I grew up with all of that. So I always understood what the military was about, and I understood the risks involved. I don't think that's widespread right now in the United States. So there's no easy answer. Now, one less point, though, to bring up about World War I. Remember that the British had almost, by European standards, no army. They had roughly 250,000, of which they could ship 150,000 to France. And that army was almost exterminated in the first few months of the war. I wrote a chapter in my book, Margin of Victory, all about the British Expeditionary Force. And the British foolishly thought that they would win the war in a great sea battle in the North Sea against the German Navy. Stop and think about that.
Which never left the harbor, by the way, the German Navy.
Well, actually, it did. It fought at Jutland. It did, Helgoland. They fought a major battle, and they did very, very well, but they were never large enough to overwhelm or defeat the British blockade. But my point is, there's a similar attitude in the United States, that things can be managed and orchestrated from a distance, from afar, that, putting large numbers of your own people at risk is unnecessary. That's what the British thought. Well, they had 800,000 dead from Britain alone as a result. We don't understand these things. We are as confused and deluded about military power as the British were, because again, we're an island. People don't get it. We're not a continental power.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is why I've argued repeatedly since the 90s. I remember having a wonderful conversation with the German chief of staff, a very wonderful man named Dieter Stuckmann. And I said, the Europeans have to have their own command and control. They have to take control of their destiny. He agreed. But he said, how do we get people to do it? Everyone was essentially punting, as we would say, the ball to us in Washington. Put your future in the hands of the Americans. I think we should be allies. I think we should be supportive of each other. But turning everything over to us, I think, was and is a mistake.
We are both synchronically dressed in black, which adds to the gloomy atmosphere of our discussion. So I cannot let you walk off, Colonel Macgregor, without a last attempt to find the silver lining at the horizon. Where is the beam of hope? Where is the source of optimism that you see? Where is this silver lining, the light in the dark tunnel? Do you see one?
I don't see how you remove the current ruling class in Washington from power soon enough to make any difference. That's the problem. I just don't. You'll have more success removing your problem children from power in Europe because, of course, you have a parliamentary system in most cases, the exception, of course, being France. We don't. And we have what we've got until there's another election, I suspect, or there's an implosion of some other kind. Who knows? But the bottom line is that I wish I could give you a more optimistic assessment at this point, but I can't. I have to read the so-called tea leaves as I see them, and that's what I see right now. And I think it's the culmination of all the various influences that I described. And remember that people like me are condemned routinely in the United States for our quote-unquote isolationism. But it was isolationism, if you want to call it that, which it's misleading because we did business with everyone in the world. This is long before the regime of sanctions. And that was our goal. Our goal was, as Washington put it, to be the world's engine of economic prosperity, not to invade other people's countries. We lost our way. World War I was the beginning of that, and we've never regained it. That's the best that I can tell you. Hopefully something will change that. But in the near term, I am not optimistic.
Mm-hmm. So let's rebrand the word isolationism in a more positively sounding leave the people alone from time to time, or try to put, this is how I would interpret your argument, to prevent the Third World War. There have to be voices in politics who start to put pressure on these belligerents and say, okay, let's cool it off, let's cool it down, and this should be the United States of America. But unfortunately, even though your president did utter some words in this direction, but the pressure from the United States at the moment on Israel not to overreact is not there. But this will be the way to stop World War III, to put some flames out, to put pressure on Israel at the moment. Would that be a way to avoid?
Yes, I think if Eisenhower were to be summoned from the grave and restored to the presidency, this would all stop, because he had a very vivid picture of the Second World War. He knew that our limitations were significant. He knew what the American people would and would not tolerate and what they could and could not do. In other words, he had a sense of limitations. Putin has a sense of limitations. Xi has a sense of limitations. We have none. Just listen to Biden. Oh, come on now. We can support two world wars at once. We have a $33 trillion national sovereign debt. We've exported our manufacturing base overseas, not because the Chinese took it, but because we saw benefit from shipping it out and making money in our elite classes. And we've opened our borders and let anybody in, and we've stopped enforcing our laws, and criminality is raging out of control. But we're the greatest nation in the world. There's nothing we can't do. This is to put it politely, insane. It's foolish nonsense. We need to get a grip on reality. I think we'll end up getting it, but it's going to be a rough road.
Well, Colonel, this brings me to the absurd conclusion that the last hope of the West are Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the probably last more reasonable.
We've got to get out of this habit of condemning people who are different from us. Yeah. They may be culturally different. They may have a different political system. They may have different values. In fact, most of them do. That doesn't make them wrong, and it doesn't make us right. It doesn't make them bad, and it doesn't make us better. So treating the world with some degree of mutual respect instead of pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over the heads of people that we don't approve of has got to stop. And Europeans have adopted this approach. It needs to go away.
Colonel, thank you very much. And I think I speak for a lot of our viewers when I say probably someday you should consider to enter the political arena again to apply for the American presidency, because some reasonable and also historically grounded knowledge and realism is desperately needed. Many, many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your insight. Always a pleasure and privilege to talk to you.
Sure, thanks very much. All the best.
Thank you. Meine Damen und Herren, wir sind damit am Ende dieser Sendung angelangt. Hochinteressant, und ich finde das immer wieder extrem lehrreich, wenn man mit erfahrenen Leuten jetzt aus dem Militär sprechen kann, die auch eine große historische Erfahrung und ein großes Wissen da mitbringen. One very, very last question. It just pops up in my mind, Colonel. I mean, you have been in combat. You have dedicated your life to the military, but also to the studies of philosophy, of history. Just in a very short point, what is the most important lesson you took out of your military experience in the field? What is the most important thing there?
It takes many years, usually a decade or two, to build an effective military establishment. Victories are won not on the day of battle, but years before, with decisions regarding equipment, most important decisions about how to fight and who should command. Those things are determined long before the war begins. And you have to understand the impact of those decisions and what you can and can't do. That brings us back to this sense of limitations. We tend to think in terms of, well, we'll go over here and fight these people. Why not consider the possibility that if you cannot be certain that you can win, don't fight?